evening and welcome to the Scotsman Great Debate in the historic Old Royal High School here in Edinburgh. If there is a change of government at the next election, this building could house the first Scottish Parliament since 1707. The Conservatives' position on that couldn't be clearer. They want no constitutional change. The Union must remain sacrosanct. But over recent months there has been a great debate. Opposition parties demand a Parliament. Labour's would be devolved from Westminster. The Nationalists would govern an independent Scotland. Last year the challenge was laid down for a public debate between the two men whose parties cast the lion's share of votes in Scotland. Shadow Scottish Secretary George Robertson and the leader of the Scottish National Party, Alex Salmond. Tonight, that fiercely anticipated debate becomes a reality. In a few moments, the leaders will be questioned by a panel of 3 eminent Scottish journalists, and later the audience of 300 who've packed this chamber will have their say. But now the question, devolution or independence? Each party leader has a chance to make his case. First, after the toss of a coin, is Alex Salmond.
Thank you, Lesley. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our debate this evening in this Parliament building is about Scotland's future. I want to outline the case for a future that can be achieved both speedily and safely. That future is independence in Europe. Scotland is an ancient nation-state. It still has the trappings of statehood. A legal system, education system, established churches, sporting teams, yet without the democratic heartbeat of nationhood, an independent parliament. This is a vacuum which stifles our voice in Europe and leads to economic and social decline at home. Now, as we approach the millennium, there is an opportunity to overcome the 18th century trap of the present union with England. Membership of the new European Union, membership that would be guaranteed to Scotland, as to England, by the process of independence, would allow Scotland a direct voice at the political nerve centre of a market of 370 million people. The advantages of such membership for small nations are not in dispute. Sweden, Austria, Finland have all been convinced of the benefits. The economic prospects of Ireland have been transformed by independent membership, and the Netherlands, Denmark and Belgium are all major players in the European scene. Even tiny Luxembourg, with a population smaller than this capital city of Edinburgh, has status in Europe. How can it be argued then that Scots and Scots alone are not talented enough or skilled enough or wise enough to run our own affairs alongside all of these other nations? For years, unionists, and I include in that description not just the do-nothing unionists like John Major, but also the do-as-little-as-possible unionists like George Robertson. Unionists have argued that independence would lead to the closure of industry, the sundering of families. Tonight, I expect you will hear more of these fears and smears, not just about Scotland, but about borders and barriers and bogeymen everywhere. The reality of Scotland's experience is that industries have closed, jobs have been exported, from Rosyth to Rolls-Royce, families have been sundered by emigration. But these things have happened not because of independence, but because of dependence, dependence on an outdated political arrangement. The present-day reality is of a borderless continent, with free trade, free movement, and freedom of employment. There is a stark contrast between the SNP's open vision of the new Europe and Labour's narrow view of regional Scotland cowering behind the walls of Fortress Britain. Scotland has the right to regain our sovereignty. Indeed, this is the only choice we can make for ourselves. Devolution would require the votes of England to bring it about, but independence requires only the votes of Scotland. Even our most bitter unionist opponent, the Prime Minister himself, has admitted that there is no English veto on Scottish independence. For far too long, we've accepted a situation in which Scotland cannot get the government we choose without the same choice being made by England. Devolution would not solve that question, the real question, the Westminster question. It would leave the commanding heights not just of the Scottish economy, but of Scottish democracy itself. They still would be left in London. Achieving devolution is difficult, as we know from bitter experience. For over 100 years, Labour has promised home rule for Scotland. During this century, they've been in government for 20 years. and yet the promise has never been delivered. Now we see a Labour Party which has let down those who passionately believed that Labour would abandon nuclear weapons, let down those who desperately want justice from the social security system, the restoration of benefits for 16 and 17-year-olds. If Labour is prepared to renege on its commitments to young people, on its commitment to nuclear disarmament, to tear up its own constitution, then how on earth can we trust their commitment to Scotland? Labour supports Scotland when Scotland supports the SNP. That is a fact in Scottish politics, demonstrated time after time. Now, a few weeks ago, in debate with me, my opponent this evening said that his mission in politics was to save the Union. That's exactly the same mission as Ian Lang, the Secretary of State for Scotland. Well, my mission in politics is to save Scotland, to reach the best constitutional settlement for the Scottish people. Independence offers the power to change Scotland for good, to build a new Scotland in the new Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Alex Salmond. Now we hear the case for devolution from George Robertson. George.
Thanks, Lesley. The Scottish people want a Scottish Parliament, but they don't want to break up their country. They say it peacefully and they say it reasonably, and they're right. A strong and powerful Scottish Parliament is Labour's promise, taking the power out of Whitehall and returning it to the people, strengthening and renewing our national democracy. And this Scottish Parliament will make a difference. No more poll taxes and the scandal of unelected quangos, sweeping away the hospital trusts and opt-out schools and returning water to democratic control. That's the difference our Parliament could make. And it will entirely avoid the chaos of fragmenting Britain and ripping Scotland out of the country which the Scots have helped to build. Do we really want to make foreigners of our family and friends down south? Do we really want a separate Scottish currency, changing money for a weekend trip to Blackpool or to shop at the Gateshead Metro Centre? Because that's what it means. Never mind the trouble for companies and industries as the Scottish pound fluctuates. Are we seriously entranced with the idea of a separate Scottish armed forces with Alex Salmond here as the Commander-in-Chief? And do we really need to face the costs and the agonies of unpicking the tax and benefit systems and arguing over our share of the national debt? Separatism offers only chaos and confusion, and the Scottish people don't want it. Labour will empower the Scottish people, not smash up the country that we know and live in. And Labour didn't just build the Scottish Parliament plan alone. We had the guts to join others in this historic project. Other parties joined the convention, even if the Tories and the Nationalists stayed away. And together with the churches and the unions, small businesses and local councils, and a huge range of civic groups, we built the plan. A plan forged in detail, forged together and built to last. A real law-making parliament, elected on a proportional system, impossible for any faction or any area to dominate, with equality of representation between men and women, financing which is fair and flexible, and a direct voice in Europe which retains the clout of being part of the British delegation. And it'll have powers which matter over housing, health and education, water and transport, the arts and the universities, the criminal justice system and economic development, and much more. Real power, and real power where it matters in daily life. Power to make new laws and to improve others. Power to innovate and to change, to experiment and to develop. Making a Scottish health service that the people deserve. Making Scotland's education system as good as it once was. fitting skills and training to the demands of today's economy and getting our youngsters especially, back to work. But only Labour can enhance Scotland's role in Britain, a new and a different Britain, a new Labour Britain. Signing the social chapter on day one, introducing a national minimum wage as a safety net for all, investing in skills, cracking down on crime, and committed to the goal of full employment. The Nationalists used to tell the Scottish people, don't vote Labour because they can't win in England. Now they tell the Scottish people, don't vote Labour because Labour is winning in England. But we're winning in Scotland too, and we're winning everywhere. The late John Smith, one of Scotland's greatest sons, lived and worked for the day when he would stand here in this very building in Edinburgh at the opening of the first Scottish Parliament in 300 years. Well, we will finish his unfinished business, and Scotland will have its Parliament, make no mistake about it. But only Labour can deliver that Parliament, because only Labour can and will get rid of the Tories.
Thanks to George Robertson. And now to introduce our panellists, all Scots and all at one time working for the Scotsman, although now they hold senior positions south of the border. Andrew Marr is a chief commentator with the Independent newspaper. Neil Asherson is a leading columnist for its sister paper, The Independent, on Sunday. And James Naughtie makes sure there's no hiding place for our top politicians every morning on Radio 4's Today programme. The first question for Alex Salmond comes from James Naughtie.
Yes, Mr. Salmond, looking at what you've been saying in devolution recently, do we take it now that if Labour does set up a Scottish Parliament, you will try to make it work?
Well, the commitment I've given, and I'm surprised it caused such a stir in the Scottish press, that if a Parliament came about, well, indeed, but if a Parliament came about, then the Scottish National Party would stand for election to that Parliament on an independence platform, and we'd seek to win the election for Scotland. I think that is a valid process in getting to independence. But I think it would be a far better option for Scotland to get to independence quicker. And our first opportunity will be the next general election and trying to win that election for Scotland then.
But if you find yourself in that Parliament, it will be your task, do you say, to make it work efficiently and not to tear it apart?
Oh, but what I would argue is a Parliament in Scotland can only work efficiently if it can remove Trident from the Clyde, restore benefits to 16 and 17-year-olds, can have access to Scotland's oil and gas revenues, and if it can have a direct and equal voice in Europe. Now, all of these things an independent Parliament can do, and none of them Labour's toothless Assembly could do.
What you've just said implies that you are going to be in this Parliament working as hard as you can to exacerbate the tensions between Edinburgh and London from day one. Are you actually going to be in a semi-wrecking role once you arrive in this Parliament?
No, what we'll be doing is trying to give Scotland the Parliament, the powerhouse Parliament that it needs. Now, as you'll be aware, an opinion poll this very morning asked people in Scotland that question. A very clear majority of people in Scotland thought it was quite legitimate for that Parliament, if it ever came about, to lead to independence. So basically, Andrew, I'm saying no more than what is the expectation of people in Scotland. Now, George, of course, says that the reason he wants a Parliament is to save the Union. I think the reason that people in Scotland want a Parliament is to deliver for Scotland, and I think that means an independent Parliament.
Alex, could I just press you here? You've talked about Robin Cook, you've talked about John Major. People want to know if you will make a goer of a devolved assembly.
Yes, I think the point I've been trying to make is I think the way to make a goer of a devolved assembly is to turn it into a powerhouse Parliament. It has
but
to
you
get
can't
the powers
change the ground rules, Alex.
Well,
once it's been set up, you must work within certain ground rules for a certain period of time, mustn't you? Mustn't you?
No, the people of Scotland would expect the Scottish National Party to stand for election to that body on our platform of independence in Europe. And what I'm absolutely delighted to be able to tell you is...
I must press you. Would you accept the rules that would be set up by, we're presuming, a Labour government and work within them to make that assembly work.
Which rules are you talking about? I mean, the verdict that we'll accept is the verdict of the Scottish people. If the Scottish people give the Scottish National Party a mandate for independence, then we'll negotiate an independent settlement. Now, what I was going to say to you was, I've got a letter here in my notes that even the Prime Minister, our most bitter unionist opponent, has said quite clearly that if Scotland determines on independence, then no English politician or party should stand in its way. It is, Lesley, a choice and a verdict of the Scottish people. It's their direction that we'll accept.
The direction I was trying to push you in was talking about devolution first. We've got a long period, and I know our panellists will bring up lots of questions to try and detail the independence stance. But what we're trying to get an answer to simply is, would you make a devolved assembly over which you couldn't change certain ground rules? Would you make it work?
No, I disagree entirely. The legitimacy in Scotland comes from legitimacy in Scotland comes from the Scottish people. We'll put forward a mandate for Scottish independence. If we're successful in getting that mandate, then of course we'll try to negotiate. Equally, if we weren't successful, then we'd have to participate in the Scottish Assembly in the same way as we participate in the Westminster Parliament at the present moment. Is that a comprehensive answer?
Yep.
Alex, I was just going to...
Andrew, could I invite you to put a question to George Robertson?
George Robertson, you made a powerfully unionist speech just now. The trouble is that an awful lot of people think that a Scottish Parliament, as proposed by the Labour Party, is a stepping stone to independence, and indeed it appears that half your own members in Scotland think that too. Now, can I put it to you as a unionist, what if they're right?
Well, I don't believe they're right, and I don't believe that the idea is right. And if I thought for a moment that it was going to be right, then I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be arguing for it. I am passionately committed against the breakup of this country that we know. Now, just a minute, Ali. Just hang on a minute. I didn't interrupt you. Now, I know you always want to get in on the act. Just hang on. I believe that the people in this country are yearning for change. They are yearning for some power to control those elements in Scottish society over the last 16 years which have been most offensive to them. The poll tax, the opt-outs in hospitals, the opt-out in schools, the things that affect their daily lives, and a Scottish Parliament will give them back control over that. I don't believe that that will lead them then to think that we could smash up the economy, unpick the systems that have been in existence for 300 years. And as I say, if I thought that that was in any way likely, I wouldn't be part of any campaign for it.
You prefer to stick with the status quo than risk slithering towards independence?
Well, I'm not arguing for the status quo. I'm arguing for one of the most radical changes to the constitution of this country that has been seen in 300 years. The reality of a parliament sitting in this building is that we will transform democracy, and not just for Scotland. Of course, the case for a Scottish Parliament stands on its own, but the case for a Welsh Assembly, and indeed for decentralisation and renewing democracy and accountability throughout the country is there, and the country as a whole is yearning for it.
Right, Mr. Robertson, you talk about a radical change to bring a parliament into this building. Would you yourself stand for election to a parliament sitting here rather than for Westminster?
I believe we are setting up a major institution, a new parliament for Scotland.
Right,
and I would be proud to be a member of this parliament. I will certainly offer myself for this parliament. But can I say this to you, Jim? I don't think that this is a matter of personal ambition, either mine or Alex Salmond's. This is a major exercise, and my job now as the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland is to put in place the building blocks for this historic development, and then to go on, I hope, as Secretary of State for Scotland, to create that parliament that will transform Scottish life and transform it for the better. I want to be part of that great adventure, but the initial stages of that are going to be difficult and hard because we'll have the Tories and we'll have the Nationalists attacking us every inch of the way. That's the immediate task, but when it comes to the day, I want to be here.
So,
I want to ask you one more supplementary on this, which is, if it is a huge success, and people look around at the end of 3 or 4 years and see how much it's achieved, that people will say, if it had yet more powers, how much more it could achieve. And then conversely, that if it were a failure and ran into terrible trouble, that people would say, this trouble is due to the fact that it doesn't have enough authority on its own without the control of Westminster, and it needs more liberty, more powers?
Well, I think that the Scottish people would expect, if they'd voted for a Scottish Parliament, as I believe they do want and do vote, because after all, my party is 32% ahead in the opinion polls of Alex's party in terms of which party they want it to work. I think they will be horrified and saddened by the fact that the leader of the Nationalist Party tells us that he's basically going to stand in the first Parliament elections for Scotland on the platform of wrecking it and breaking up the United Kingdom at the first part. That's effectively what he's saying. I think that there will in Scotland be genuine goodwill in wanting to make the Parliament work. But I can't foresee the future.
I'd like to put the question to Alex Salmond. What really would happen? What would you do if there was an assembly, if there was a parliament, if you won a majority in it, and if the Westminster Parliament, in its majority, said no to the result of a referendum on independence, which asked for independence?
Well, it's certainly true that if you look at the English opinion polls, and I think it's been very interesting in the last few weeks, really for the first time to get a sounding of English opinion on the issue, then they're by no means hostile to the concept of Scottish self-government. And indeed, in some ways, they seem friendlier to it than George Robertson. And I'll tell you why, because the English electorate in a Telegraph poll said that they thought that Scotland should have a parliament if they wanted. The second question was, do you believe that parliament will lead to independence? By a majority of 4-1, the English people thought it would lead to independence, but still wanted the parliament. George only wants the parliament if he can keep it in a straitjacket. Well,
you said in
Jim, can I see if George wants to come in at that point? George, will you respond to that?
To respond to what? It just seems a series of assertions here. I don't think it actually takes the argument any further forward at all.
I have a question for you. You said in answer to the journalist earlier on that if you thought a Scottish Assembly or Parliament would lead to independence, then you wouldn't be arguing for it. Now, most of us say would argue for what we thought was best for the Scottish nation and would leave the Scottish nation to decide where it wanted to go. Why did you make that point?
Absolutely. I make the point that I believe that this will satisfy what the Scottish people want. It will give them the best bargain. It will strengthen our democracy, and they will stay part of the Britain that they are part of and that they helped to build. Sure. That is the thing. You're saying that you'll take the Scottish Parliament, that you will vote for, because you've said that you're going to vote for it in Parliament, and then wreck it. Go on a platform of wrecking it without even giving it a try. That's not trusting the people, Alex.
Opinion poll evidence, both south and north of the border, says that people think a Scottish Assembly would lead to independence, but people are still supportive of the Assembly. You're a conditional supporter of the Assembly. You only want to argue for a Parliament if you think you can bind it hand and foot in the solution that you're arguing for. Why can't you accept the verdict of the Scottish people?
The people can vote for you. Just a minute, let me answer your question. The opinion poll that matters today says that you're only 1% higher than you got in the last general election 2 years ago. If we're going to swap around the opinion poll figure, people in Scotland want a Labour government. That's what they want, and a Labour government committed to a devolved parliament. The people can make the choice. If they want to vote for you,
gentlemen?
They can vote for you.
We obviously opened Pandora's box somewhat early here by asking you to interchange. Over recent months, each leader has made claim and counterclaim. We've just heard some of them. Now we will have, although we had a premature taste of it, we will now have a head-to-head moment where the two leaders can challenge each other about their vision for a future Scotland. Alec, your question first for George.
Thank you, Lesley. George, I don't know if you managed to see the On the Record programme today, where, but just in case you didn't, I brought along some quotes from Jack Straw, who's the Shadow Home Secretary. He was talking about devolution for Scotland. He said, you would not be transferring sovereignty. Power devolved is power retained. The Westminster Parliament would remain sovereign. The powers can be taken back. Hasn't Jack Straw blown the gaff on the devolution plan? If a hostile Westminster government came into power in London, they could abolish your Scottish Assembly just as Margaret Thatcher abolished the GLC. Isn't that correct?
It is an insult to make a comparison between the legislative parliament that we are going to create and the GLC. I cannot envisage the circumstances where any government, any Westminster government in its right mind, having seen the creation of the Scottish Parliament, in existence and popular, is going to wipe that away. You know and everybody else knows that in this country there is no written constitution. There is the risk inherent in the constitution that the government can abolish elections, can prolong its own life, but the reason it doesn't use these draconian powers is because of the force and the power of public opinion. The reality is we are going to create an institution which will be entrenched in the Scottish people through the work that it does and the connection it has with the Scottish people, and nobody is going to dare take it away. And just let me remind you
like
that,
Margaret Thatcher.
just a minute, Councillor Jim Mitchell, he's your local government spokesman, isn't he, Alex?
He isn't,
the
actually. He isn't, but never mind.
SNP, very vocal, very prominent SNP councillor, member of your National Executive Committee, said
but not a local government
that our devolved parliament would probably last for hundreds of years. Councillor Brian Meek, one of the last remaining elected Tories in Scotland, said once a Scottish parliament was set up, it would never be abolished even by the Tories. Now, there's two people who see the common sense of the view that we're putting forward.
So the entrenchment for a Scottish Parliament depends on the view of Councillor Brian Meek. Are you actually saying? Are you actually saying that?
What about Jim Mitchell? What about Jim Mitchell?
Are you actually saying that a Thatcher government which imposed the poll tax on the Scottish people against the popular will, such a government or a government like it wouldn't be capable of abolishing a Scottish Parliament? They certainly would have the right to do so under Westminster rules, and isn't that what Jack Straw said this morning?
No, he didn't. And
He
would
did.
you
Say it here.
Alex, let George
the
reply.
Westminster Parliament can do anything. But are you forgetting that it was the poll tax that ultimately was swept away and Mrs. Thatcher with it? There was a number of things that Mrs. Thatcher could and might have done and didn't do. But the fact is that she would not and could not, and neither could anybody else, sweep away a legislative parliament sitting in Scotland that had, at its very roots, the power of the Scottish people.
George, a question for Alex, please.
Well, Alec, your party supports a separate currency. So why is it that ordinary Scots should have to change their money when they go across the border for a holiday to Blackpool, as they would, or to shop at the Gateshead Metro Centre? You told me in a letter that you sent me that this would be a minor inconvenience. A minor inconvenience. Well, it might be a minor inconvenience to you with your switch card and your credit card, but for the ordinary folk of Scotland, it would be a heavy penalty, but very good news for the high street banks and for Thomas Cook.
I think you'll find that a lot of the ordinary people in Scotland actually have credit cards and cash line cards, George. And what they would do is take these cards and use them in any machine. Let's just say this was an Allied Irish Bank instead of a Royal Bank of Scotland card I had in my hand here. I could use this in Charlotte Square in the Allied Irish Bank. Indeed, I could use it in any of the 6,000 link machines across the UK. And there's no transaction cost on these transactions whatsoever. Unless, of course, George, you have to have your account in credit. Is your account in credit?
If you really do seriously imagine, Alec, that that is an answer that's going to satisfy the Scottish people, they're all clutching their American Express gold card as they cross the border for a weekend in Blackpool. They all go down there buying things with credit cards. You must live in a very odd world, very remote from the ordinary people of Scotland, who are the people who would at the end of the day have to pick up the tab.
Let me try something else on you, George. Let me try a Royal Bank of Scotland note. Now, I get a lot of letters from people complaining that this is a sterling note, of course, that they can't use this sterling note south of the border because people refuse to take it. I get even more letters from people who try to change this in international transactions and find they're offered a lower rate of exchange than from other sterling notes. Now, if Scotland has an independent currency, at least we'll have a first-class currency like everyone else and not second-class sterling as we have this now.
Well, now, I tell you this, Alec, when you wave the credit card in the air, you'll remind all these people in Scotland who were told by the SNP not to pay their poll tax, because they'll remember your guys paying with the credit cards and the checkbooks and leaving thousands of poor people in Scotland in debt and misery. That's the difference between those who can use the credit card.
George, if it had been left to you, we'd still have the poll tax in Scotland.
as the subject is drifting in any case, Alex, can I ask you to ask another question?
I thought it was doing all right, Lesley.
You always do, Alex. That's the problem.
I want to continue this discussion about this conditional support you have for a Scottish Assembly. That is to say, as I did interpret you saying earlier, that you would only support it if you thought it wouldn't lead to independence. Now, as I've said already to Neil Acheson, I've got a letter here from the Prime Minister saying that if Scotland votes for independence, the game's up with Westminster. Now, I wrote to Tony Blair a week or so back, asking him to make the same commitment. I haven't got the letter yet. Can you make that commitment this evening? Well, if Scots determine on independence, then no English politician or party will stand in our way.
The Scottish people have got the right to vote for the same independence as Slovakia or Slovenia or for Georgia or Lithuania. If you want to take the countries that have become recently independent, of course they have. They can vote for your party. In 60 years of the Scottish National Party, you've lost every general election, all 13 of them. But people are entitled to vote for you, and if they believe in breaking up the United Kingdom and the wreckage and the chaos that would be created, and they want to create a separate Scottish state, then of course they've got a democratic right to do so.
I've got no complaint with the Scottish National Party not achieving our ambitions when we don't win a majority of seats. I think the complaint that Scotland has about you, George, is for the last 16 years you've achieved a majority of seats in Scotland, but nothing whatsoever has been delivered.
And that is about to change. That is about to change. And if people in Scotland want to vote for the separatists and they want separation, they could have voted for you. You've 3 MPs, we've 49 MPs. You're on 22% in the opinion polls, and we are on 55%. That is the reality of today's Scotland. But if you can change people's minds in Scotland, then obviously that's the route to go down. Now, Alex, you know, of course you know, you might not admit it in public, but you know that you are not, and your party are not going to win 37 seats in Scotland at the next general election. And that's why you've started to say that you're going to support in the House of Commons Labour's devolution plan. But you know as well, inside yourself, that only Labour can actually remove the Tories from office and get that Scottish Parliament. So why should anybody in Scotland at the next election vote for the SNP and split the Home Rule vote?
No. 2 things. One, George, that I'm not giving any guarantees about Labour's devolution legislation until I see the legislation. And I'm getting kind of suspicious that after 6 years of the Constitutional Convention, you don't seem yet to be in a position to produce a devolution bill. Where's the bill, George?
Wait a minute. Now answer the question. Answer my question.
Well, tell me, I mean, you
asked me a question.
Well,
hang on a minute. It's my turn to ask you a question. You're sounding more and more like John Major every minute.
I thought
he never answers questions. He just asks them back George, across the chamber.
I thought you were about to produce the bill. I mean, come on.
Go on, answer the question.
Well, George,
why should anybody vote for the SNP? Because it'll split the Home Rule.
Well, 2 reasons, George. One is this: that the Scottish National Party, as you well know, despite your dire prophecies to the contrary, achieved 33% in the vote in the Euro elections last year, the last national test in Scotland. That was a very, very considerable success for the SNP. I'm not one of these people who says, you know, as you say, we're definitely going to win this, we're definitely going to win that. I am actually saying that the people of Scotland will decide who wins the election, and they'll decide that on the basis of the arguments put forward. And what we've established tonight is that independence is a decision for the Scots and Scots alone. That devolution is subject, as it has been for the last 100 years, for an English veto. That, I think, is going to assist my party greatly when we confront you at the polls at the next general election. And before you write off our prospects, George, then you think that the attractions of taking our future into our own hands through a vote for independence.
Just let me ask you. Good way of judging it down. Just look me straight in the eye Are you going to win 37 seats at the next election?
Well, I wouldn't limit myself at 37, George.
3 and 9 degrees.
Well, I think that's what you call a full and frank exchange. We're now going to pick up many of the issues there, again with our panellists. I think, Neil Acheson, you're going to kick off.
Listening to both of you and listening to such this witty and dazzling exchange, I can't help feeling that it is because of witty, dazzling scenes like these that Scotland has been stuck in this mess for the last 30 years and nothing has happened. What you are both doing is you are damaging the collective general self-confidence of Scottish people in the whole general project of managing our own affairs.
No, we're not. Quite frankly, Neil, that's democracy. The development of democratic ideas and the clash of ideas, and there is a huge chasm, not just across this Parliament floor, between the two ideas that we put forward. But I say to you, as somebody now living south of the border, but watching back to your native land, in 1988, the Scottish Constitutional Convention was created with the specific job of bringing together all elements in Scottish society to try and find together a plan for the future government of Scotland. Now, the Tories had nothing to do with it, and nor would they. The Nationalists came in, sat round a table, and then walked out in high dudgeon. But there are still other political parties in there. The plan that we are putting forward, the plan that we've got, the plan that Alex Salmond pretends doesn't exist, is there, endorsed by the Liberal Democrats and by the Labour Party, by the churches in Scotland, by the unions, by local councils and councillors even of the Nationalist and of the Conservative persuasion, who all came together and said precisely what you're saying. For goodness sake, let's do what's best for Scotland. We've got that plan there. It's not a Labour plan. It's a plan by the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and it's there on offer in the next election for people to take up. We haven't damaged democracy. Democracy is alive and well, and we've produced a scheme that came out of the people, and they can vote for it in the next election, or they can vote for separatism. The choice is there.
I think there are two divides in Scottish politics, is there not? There is a divide, the one that you allude to, which is the change against no change. And if you take that divide, then of course 80% or so of the people in Scotland desperately want some change. But it surely is a legitimate debate about the mechanism to achieve that change. And I think with some force I've mentioned that we've had that sort of majority for devolutionary change in Scotland for a very long time and nothing has happened. The second argument, I'd say, is there's another divide in Scottish politics, which is a very, very important one, and that's between the unionist camp and the independence camp. And while there are some people in George's party who I think are very, very close to the nationalist or the independence position, George is clearly not among them because of his statements earlier this evening when he said, you know, if he thought it would lead to independence, he would have nothing to do or campaign for any change in Scotland. I think the exchange of ideas is a legitimate one. All I'm interested in is the people of Scotland exercising their right to choose. We've got to lay out the case as best we can and leave it to the people.
Do you believe that separate Scottish representation in the European Union would automatically produce more gains for Scotland than Scotland with a devolved parliament as part of a UK delegation?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, I visited Austria just before Christmas, and I asked all of the parties in Austria that I met, you know, wouldn't it be much better, I said, if you went into the new Europe as a land of Germany as opposed to an independent nation in your own right? All of the parties thought that was a ridiculous proposition.
Yeah,
and all of the small nations in Europe...
But, sorry, you can't surely be allowed to make a comparison between the relationship of Germany and Austria, which has got some peculiar historical background to it, and the relationship between England and Scotland in a union since 1707. I mean, it's such a glib analogy, it's not worth discussing.
Okay. Let's take the argument of Sweden and Germany. And the argument is, would you be better in as a region of a big country or as an independent nation in your own right? Now, 10 out of the 15 nations in the new Europe are what you can categorise as small nations. I think every single one of them values their independence and the powers that gives them within Europe. That, I think, is equality of status in Europe. I don't think Scotland should settle for second best.
I'd like to thank George. I'd like to bring George in, if I may, just for a minute. George.
Well, I think this is just a ludicrous argument that has been put forward, because did you ask, or have you met Chancellor Franz Franitzky of Austria and asked him whether it would be a good idea if the Tyrol part of Austria was to become independent and have a top seat at the table? We're not actually... Hang on, impatient Alex again. The point is, we're not talking about joining up countries. You're talking about splitting up countries. And I've spoken to Franz Franitzky, the Chancellor of Austria, and to Felipe González, the Prime Minister of Spain, and to Paul Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, and they'll all tell you that if you start splitting up little nation states into smaller nation states, and they all assume that they're going to be round this table, the table's going to be in the Heysel Stadium in Brussels, and not in the Council of Ministers. They don't think it's credible, they don't think it's realistic, so your comparison is just nothing to do with the issue.
But that is exactly the difference between us, George. You see, I don't think Scotland is a district, an area, a local government, or a regional kingdom.
Well, clearly, as we've been hearing tonight, apart from the three panellists, there are a great many people here who'd like to ask questions of the two men. If you would like to ask a question now, please raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone to you.
Mr. Salmond, your sole survival strategy for an independent Scotland is independence in Europe. What will you do if you hold a referendum for Scotland to join the European Union and the people of Scotland turn round and say no? Will you come running back to Westminster and say, please let us in because we can't get into Europe?
No. If that happened, I would accept the verdict of the Scottish people. But I don't think. Well,
how would you survive?
Well, presumably the same way as Norway is surviving at the present moment. But
The gentleman there.
Aren't you actually taking on the responsibilities and also taking on the blame, in the sense that you will get the blame for everything that goes wrong without having any real power from that Parliament that at the moment comes from Westminster? You won't be able to decide how much money that you're going to get to spend.
Well, the total amount of money will be there to spend. The Parliament will have power.
The total amount that Westminster gives you will be there to spend.
The total
No
amount.
more
And
no
it will
less
have
than we get
powers
just
to
now.
raise revenue over and above that. The fact is that it will have powers to increase revenue if it wants to, if it's
So you're
willing
going
to
to
take
put
the
weapons on
political
to get
risk
that
to
extra
do
money.
that. But it has the choices inside that budget. It can legislate. It will have power over all of the range of functions in the Scottish office. It's not going to take over from local government. This is not some souped-up local authority. This is going to be a Parliament with legislative powers, able to innovate, able to experiment, able to renew the democracy of Scotland and the institutions of Scotland. And even although there are going to be tensions and problems, and goodness gracious, what Parliament is not going to have that, it will be open and it will be accountable to the people of Scotland.
Okay, a question for Alex. Yes, lady here.
I'd like to ask a question to both of the gentlemen, really, and I think it should be a fairly straightforward and simple one to answer. What is your second choice? We know what your first choice is. We have independence, devolution, or the status quo. What is your second choice?
well, these are the, when people say this is an easy question to answer, it's always the most difficult questions of all. But I mean, I'll be quite honest. You've said it: independence, devolution, status quo. I think independence is first for Scotland. I think anything else is second best. I think the status quo is absolutely abysmal.
George.
I don't see it in these stark terms. I believe that what we are offering here is to answer questions. The thing is that we are going to create something inside Britain, inside the United Kingdom. I don't believe that I need to make that choice at all. The alternatives are there. I'm not voting for either of the other two alternatives. One of them is not... You see, this, Lesley, is what you come to expect,
George,
you know,
George, there
over
has
the
been
years.
3 choruses tonight, as there haven't been before, of people, everyone, I think, wants an answer to that question. Can you give us your
I
1-2?
don't believe that you can answer that question in the terms that are there. I don't believe that independence is good. I don't believe that the status quo is an
But George,
alternative. I believe that
under the Constitutional Convention proposals, there would be PR in Assembly. You're simply being asked a PR question.
No,
would
I'm
it be
not.
1 or 2?
That's not the form of, it's not the form of PR we have. You vote. This is the sort of SNP trick question that you come to expect from here.
can we have
I
one
don't
last
have.
chance?
There are no second prizes.
Can we have some silence,
prize.
please? Our questioner is
I
trying
am
to say...
not an SNP member. I'm not a member of any political party, and I'm not particularly an SNP voter. I'm a floating voter.
Well,
Right.
I'm simply saying
You're
to you,
the sort of
you've got
person you need to convince.
Well, I hope that I can. But I don't believe that these are the three stark choices that are there. We are promoting a Labour government, with all that goes with the Labour government as well, because the Labour government will transform the whole of this country and the whole of the economy, and a better system of government.
We've come to the stage, very difficult for both Alex and George, which is to sum up their points in 2 minutes exactly. Alex Salmond, would you like to go first?
Or even less. Well, there was some comment in the Scottish press and elsewhere that Ian Lang wasn't to be present at this debate tonight. In some ways, I don't think Ian Lang had to be present. I think George Robertson, in some of his language, was doing a very good imitation indeed. Because the unionist fears and smears argument is exactly the same, whether it comes from the Tory party or indeed the Labour party. My contention in this debate is quite simple, that Scotland is a European nation. We're just as good, just as capable as any other European nation to find our destiny within that new European entity. 100 years of Scots voting for devolution has produced no change whatsoever. And George admitted tonight that if he felt that devolution would lead to independence, he wouldn't even argue for devolution. A damning admission which will come back to haunt him. The lady who couldn't get an answer to her question, the reason you couldn't get an answer to your question is George's second choice is the Tories and the Union. That's why you couldn't get an answer to your question. I'm looking for a parliament, not to save the United Kingdom, to save Britain as my mission in politics. I'm looking for a parliament to change Scotland. When the old Scottish Parliament was abolished, it was termed the end of an old sang. I think we've got to go forward to a new beginning as a new nation within the new Europe. Thank you.
George.
I believe that we are on the brink of a new history for Scotland. I believe that we will set up a Scottish Parliament that will strengthen the country, both the nation of Scotland but the country that we live and work in as well. If I believed that it had within it the seeds of its own destruction, as some would sow, and some have said this evening they would sow right from the very beginning, then I would be cautious about what we are about. That we are about creating a Parliament for Scotland, and a Parliament will in itself satisfy the views and the aspirations and the yearnings of the Scottish people, and I believe that it will be a Parliament for the future. And when the general election comes, the people of Scotland will have a clear choice about their constitutional future. A Tory party which refuses to deliver, a nationalist party which only dreams of delivery, and Labour which can and will deliver that Scottish Parliament inside and strengthening Britain, the Britain that people want. The SNP say that they can go, and Alex said it this evening, can go to 37 seats and beyond, and that money and promises are going to flow thereafter. But the SNP has lost all elections, all 13 general elections that it's fought in its 60-year history. Winning for the SNP is a fantasy. This is no time in our history to erect new barriers on these islands. The young people, especially of Scotland, expect more than new stamps and flags and armies. They want jobs and homes and training, and they want hope. And they want that soon. A Labour government is within reach, and with it will come that Scottish Parliament, the first in 3 centuries. The Scottish people can reach out. Their time is coming.
Thank you both. That was the great debate, or perhaps just the start of it. With a general election perhaps only 2 years away, the arguments and the party divisions will continue. Will we be here before the end of the century to witness the birth of a new Parliament? The answer ultimately lies in your hands. From the Assembly Chamber in Edinburgh, from me, Lesley Riddoch, good night.